When Sidney Kibrick died earlier this year, the last door of our gang slammed shut behind us. And that was when people suddenly realized more than 100 years had gone by. Long enough for a whole golden era of Hollywood to turn into memory. Long enough for the kids who once made America laugh to slowly become names left behind in some of the saddest files in movie history. But what gives me chills even more than the passage of time is this cast itself. The Little Rascals feels like a real curse. The sweetest little girl in the group never made it out of the hospital after a surgery that was supposed to be completely routine. And one of those kids never even got the chance to reach adulthood before life got cut off at 16. Watch this whole video and see how the people we once loved left this world, and realize those kids never really had a normal life, while Hollywood stayed exactly the same, greedy, rotten, and ready to curse anybody who steps into its spotlight. Number 1. Carl Switzer as Alfalfa. Carl Switzer deserves to be at the top of this list because Alfalfa was not just a famous character. He was one of the most unforgettable faces in all of our gang, to the point that by the end of 1937, Carl was even more popular than George Spanky McFarland, who had always been seen as the central star of the series. What makes this story sad is not that Carl was once famous, but what happened when he grew up. Carl left our gang in 1940 when he was only 12. After that, he kept acting, but most of it was in small parts or B movies, and none of those roles were big enough to help him escape Alfalfa's shadow. Little by little, Carl made a living doing all kinds of work, from bartending to raising dogs, training hunting dogs, and working as a hunting guide. He married Diantha Collingwood in 1954, had a son, and then that marriage fell apart in 1957. Looking back, this was not the story of a former child star living comfortably after the spotlight faded. It was the story of a man trying to get by after Hollywood stopped caring about the kid who once made audiences all across the country laugh. But the last years of Carl's life were where the real tragedy hit. In January 1958, he was wounded in the arm while getting into a car outside a bar in Studio City, and the shooter was never caught. Later that same year, Carl was arrested again for cutting down 15 pine trees in Sequoia National Forest to sell for Christmas, and he was fined and put on probation. By then, his life was already unstable, money was tight, and everything had started to take on the look of a man running out of breath. Then, in January 1959, a small disagreement turned into disaster. Carl had once trained a hunting dog for his longtime friend, Moses Bud Stilts. When the dog ran off, Carl paid reward money out of his own pocket to get it back. After the dog was returned, he wanted Stilts to pay him back. Carl and a friend went to Stilts' house in Mission Hills to talk. The confrontation got out of control fast, and Carl was shot during the struggle. He died on January 21, 1959, at only 32 years old. At the time, the case was ruled self-defense, but later on there were different accounts that made people question whether the whole thing had been seen clearly from the start. And then, even Carl's death was bleak in a way that hurts. He was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but even the news of his death that day was partly overshadowed because it happened on the exact same day Cecil B. DeMille died. A boy who had once been that famous, and even on the day he left this world, he still did not get to fully remain at the center of attention. And the next story is going to remind us even more clearly that sometimes the gentlest faces on screen end up going through final chapters nobody is ever really ready to accept. Number 2. Darla Hood as Darla. Darla Hood's story makes me just as sad, but this was not the case of a child star fading away. Quite the opposite. Darla was one of the people who seemed to make the smoothest transition out of childhood fame in the whole group. She was the main girl of our gang from 1935 to 1941, remembered as sweet, sharp, and gifted, with a real singing talent. For a whole lot of American viewers, Darla was not just a member of the Little Rascals. She was almost the most deeply feminine image tied to the memory of that series. After leaving our gang, Darla did not disappear. That is what makes this story hurt even more. She studied in Los Angeles, started a singing group while she was at Fairfax High School, then joined the famous stage show Ken Murray's Blackouts. After that, Darla performed solo in nightclubs, showed up regularly. On television, appeared on The Ken Murray Show, The Merv Griffin Show. The Jack Benny program, acted in The Bat, with Vincent Price, made records, and did singing or voice work for Campbell's Soup and Chicken of the Sea commercials. In other words, Darla was not just living off old memories. She really did build an adult life as a performer. And maybe that is exactly why Darla's ending was so shocking. In 1979, she was still working and busy organizing a Little Rascals reunion for the following year. Nobody looking at that moment would have thought Darla was anywhere near the end of her life. She went into Canoga Park Hospital for an appendectomy, something that did not sound remotely like the beginning of a tragedy. But the cruel part was that the seed of disaster was already there during treatment. According to the autopsy, Darla contracted hepatitis from contaminated blood given to her during surgery. Darla Hood died on June 13, 1979. The listed cause was heart failure after complications from that treatment. She was only 48. She was still working, still remembered, still in the middle of returning to the very legacy that had made her famous. And maybe that is why Darla's death is not just sad. It leaves you stunned because everything was cut off right at the moment when nobody thought they needed to prepare to say goodbye. Number 3. Matthew Beard as Stymie. On-screen Stymie was one of the smartest and quickest kids in our gang. Matthew signed a 5-year contract with the series from 1930 to 1935, taking over after Farina and later being followed by Buckwheat. Director Robert McGowan even said Stymie was his favorite child in the whole group. But off-screen, Matthew Beard did not grow up in peace or comfort. The money he earned from films helped support a very large family in East Los Angeles, which means that even as a child, he was carrying more on his shoulders than the audience ever saw on screen. After leaving our gang in 1935, Beard still appeared in a few films like Captain Blood Jezebel and The Return of Frank James, but as he got older, the roles became fewer and fewer, and then pretty much disappeared. That is where the story starts turning brutal. And now this is where the tragedy really comes crashing in. Beard fell into street life, got arrested while still very young for stealing to support his drug habit, then became deeply addicted to heroin, and almost lost most of his early adult years in a cycle of addiction and jail. What has always broken my heart about Matthew Beard is that he did not stay there. In the 1960s, he checked himself into Synanon, got off heroin, came back to acting in small roles on Sanford and Son Emergency. The Jeffersons, Maude had a recurring role on Good Times and also traveled around speaking out against drug abuse. In other words, he really did pull himself back up on his own, and maybe that is why his ending leaves such a deep sense of loss. On January 3, 1981, just 2 days after his birthday, according to the way this project counts it, Beard suffered a stroke, fell down the stairs, and injured his head. He died on January 8 from pneumonia at age 56 and was buried at Evergreen Cemetery with that famous derby hat. Some lives are sad because people fall too fast. Matthew Beard's is sad because he fell for so long, so hard, and then still somehow found the strength to pull himself back up, only for time to cut him off right when he had finally recovered part of himself. And the next story hurts in a different way, because some kids never even got to live through all the years of growing up before life stopped them too soon. Number 4. Billy Laughlin as Froggy. Billy Laughlin is probably the most shocking story on this list because his life almost closed before it ever really got the chance to open. Unlike the others who had to go through a bruising adulthood before reaching the end, Billy rose fast, left a strong impression, and was gone just a few years after our gang ended. Billy was born in 1932, joined the series in 1940 with the new pupil, and quickly became recognizable to audiences through the role of Froggy. From being a new face, Billy gradually became the comic lead of the final period, taking over the central place Alfalfa had held in earlier years. In the last years of our gang, Billy appeared in a whole run of shorts, like 1, 2, 3, Go, Don't Lie Surprised Parties, Melodies Old and New, and eventually reached the final film of the whole series, Dancing Romeo, in 1944. So Billy's time with the audience was not long, but it was strong enough to make Froggy one of the most unforgettable memories of the MGM years. That is why Billy's life after the screen leaves people speechless. When our gang stopped production in 1944, he only appeared one more time in Johnny Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which was also his only role outside our gang, and one of the very few times audiences ever got to hear Billy speak in his real voice on film. Then there was almost nothing else. No adult chapter long enough to tell. No long downward spiral dragging on for years. With Billy Laughlin, the tragedy is in that very absence. On August 31st, 1948, Billy was delivering newspapers near his home in La Puente, California, riding on the back of a Cushman motor scooter driven by his 16-year-old friend, John Wilbrand. When the scooter turned around in front of an approaching truck, the accident happened. Billy was taken to the hospital, but did not survive, while his friend only suffered minor injuries. The detail that makes this story even more painful is that Billy's parents had given him that scooter just 2 weeks earlier. By the way, I count his age. Billy died that year at only 16. Froggy is still right there on film with those thick glasses and that strange, raspy voice. Billy is the one who never got the chance to show the audience what kind of man he would have grown up to be. Number 5. Norman Chaney as Chubby. Norman Chaney is one of the saddest stories in our gang because his tragedy began with the very thing that made audiences remember him. Chubby did not become famous because of a scandal or some shocking event off-screen. He became famous because of his chubby build and that slow-reacting but funny way he had that made him impossible to forget. In 1929, when Hal Roach needed a round little boy to replace Joe Cobb in the sound era, Norman won a nationwide talent search and signed a 2-year contract. He appeared in 19 short films from 1929 to 1931, including Railroadin' Boxing Gloves' Teacher's Pet, and especially Love Business, where Chubby gets mixed up in that innocent little competition with Jackie Cooper for Miss Crabtree's attention. But Norman's story started turning sad very early. By 1931, he had grown taller and noticeably heavier, and our gang did not renew his contract. Norman went back to Baltimore and attended school like any ordinary boy, but his body was no longer ordinary. Even though he ate and moved around, the same as before, he kept gaining weight, eventually going over 300 pounds, while his height stayed around 4 feet. That was no longer a story about a cute, chubby kid. It was a serious medical condition. Later on, doctors determined that Norman had a gland disorder. In 1935, he entered Johns Hopkins for treatment, and from there, the real tragedy finally began. During treatment, Norman's weight dropped at an extreme rate from over 300 pounds to under 140, and by the time he died, he was down to around 110. His body could not take that kind of violent change. Norman Chaney died on May 29, 1936, from myocarditis at only 22. What makes this story even sadder is that after his death, history almost forgot him one more time. He was buried at Baltimore Cemetery, but his grave went without a headstone for 76 years because his mother could not afford one for both of them. It was not until 2012, after a fan fundraiser, that Norman finally got a proper headstone. To me, that is the most painful detail in this whole story. Number 6. George McFarland as Spanky. George McFarland holds a very particular place on this list because the sadness around him did not come from a violent shock, like Alfalfa, or an ending as sudden as Darla's. Spanky's sadness was quieter, but in a way, it was more true to old Hollywood. If there is one name that is almost synonymous with The Little Rascals, it is Spanky. George joined our gang in 1932, and over the next decade he appeared in 95 short films, becoming the sharp, confident little boy who was almost the one setting the rhythm for the whole group. By the middle of the 1930s, he had become such a central face that MGM even moved him into his own feature film, General Spanky, in 1936. For a whole lot of American audiences, Spanky was not just a character, he was the face of the entire brand. But that is also exactly what made George McFarland's life so bittersweet. Once you become famous too early and too deeply in the public eye, people have a hard time seeing you as anybody else. George left acting while he was still a teenager, then joined the U.S. Air Force in 1952. After that, he worked all kinds of jobs that were a whole lot more ordinary than his childhood, from a soft drink plant, a hamburger stand, and a popsicle factory, to selling liquor, electrical equipment, and furniture. Later on, he became more settled in sales, then started appearing at events, going on television, and talking about his years as a child star. When Our Gang was rerun on television under the name The Little Rascals, George even hosted a children's show in Tulsa called The Spanky Show. That was the biggest irony of his life. George McFarland could grow up, change jobs, get married, and become an adult man, but Spanky never really left him. George McFarland died on June 30th, 1993, at his home in Grapevine, Texas. By the way, I count his age, he was 65. Contemporary sources describe the cause as either a heart attack or an aneurysm, and he was later cremated. Some child stars are sad because they fall too fast. George McFarland is sad because he lived long enough to see the whole country still remember Spanky, while he himself spent almost his entire life trying to find a place outside that name. Number 7. Bobby Hutchins as Wheezer. Bobby Hutchins leaves behind a very particular kind of sadness in our gang because Wheezer was always one of the smallest, youngest, and maybe also the most fragile faces in the whole group. Bobby joined the series in 1927 when he was only about 2 years old and stayed until 1933. In those 6 years, he appeared in 58 short films, making it through both the silent era and the early sound era. What makes this story hurt is that Bobby almost never got an adult chapter long enough for audiences to follow. He left our gang at the end of the 1932 to 1933 season when he was only about 8. Outside the series, Bobby only had a few more brief appearances in 3 other films in the early 1930s. After that, the family returned to Tacoma. Bobby went to public school, graduated from high school, and then joined the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1943. He chose a path completely different from Hollywood, entering pilot training with the goal of becoming a military aviator. That is what really makes this story sting. Bobby did not die trapped in Wheezer's shadow on film. He died right when he was trying to step fully into a brand new life. On May 17, 1945, during a landing exercise at Merced Army Airfield in California, the AT-6 Bobby was flying collided in midair with another AT-6 from the same unit. The pilot in the other plane survived, but Bobby did not. He died at only 20. And even more heartbreaking than that, Bobby's mother had been getting ready to attend her son's flight school graduation the following week. Some faces from our gang are sad because they had to live a very long time with the shadow of a famous childhood. Bobby Hutchins is sad because he almost did not get enough time to live long enough with any shadow at all. Number 8. Scotty Beckett, as Scotty Beckett, is one of the heaviest stories on this list because he did not lack opportunities. Quite the opposite. If you look at his early years, Scotty seemed like one of the kids with the brightest road ahead after our gang. He was in the series from 1934 to 1935, playing the quick little friend who was often alongside Spanky with that crooked cap and that sweater slipping off one shoulder that made him easy to remember. But unlike a lot of castmates who stayed tied only to our gang, Scotty kept going quite a bit further. After that, he appeared in a number of major films, played the boy Al Jolson in The Jolson Story, and by the early 1950s, he even had a leading role in Rocky Jones' Space Ranger. Put simply, Hollywood did not turn its back on Scotty too early. He really did have a stretch of success that many former child stars could only hope for, and that is exactly why the rest of his life feels so sad. After drifting out of the acting orbit, Beckett could not hold on to the rhythm of his life. He sold real estate, sold cars, went back to school 2 different times, planning to study medicine, but never made it all the way through. Alongside that came a string of arrests for drunkenness, drunk driving, drug possession, and passing bad checks. In 1957, he was arrested after trying to cross the Mexican border with 250 stimulant pills. In 1959, he was arrested again for carrying Benzedrine, and then just a few days later, he crashed his car into a tree, breaking his hip and fracturing his skull. By 1962, he had even made one attempt to end his own life after a very heavy drinking episode. With Scotty, the tragedy was not that he ran out of chances, but that his life kept slipping off the rails little by little, and he could never pull it back. Scotty's final chapter was dark in that old Hollywood kind of way, too. On May 8, 1968, he entered a nursing home in Los Angeles for treatment after a very severe beating, the circumstances of which were never really made clear. 2 days later, Scotty Beckett was found dead in his room at age 39. Number 9. Alan Hoskins as Farina before Spanky, before Alfalfa. Even before the names audiences today mention the most, there was Farina. He entered our gang in 1922, when he was just over 1 year old, stayed until 1931, and appeared in 105 short films. In those early years, Farina was not just a member of the group. He was a real pillar, the best-known character of the series in its earliest era, and for a lot of researchers, he is even considered the first black child star in Hollywood with true national stature. Alan's final contract with Hal Roach paid him $350 a week more than the other child actors of that same period. That was a very high level of fame for a child in the 1920s. But Alan Hoskins' story also shows just how cold old Hollywood could be. When Farina got older and no longer fit the small and cute image the studio wanted to hold on to, Alan was pushed out of the series very quickly. Newspapers in 1931 openly wrote that the boy once recognized all across the country could no longer earn money in Hollywood because he was not small and cute anymore. Early in 1931, Alan was still a highly paid star. By July that same year, he was unemployed. After that, Alan performed in vaudeville with his sister Janny for a while, then gradually moved away from the screen. He enlisted in 1940, served in World War II, and later shifted fully into another life, working in rehabilitation and helping people with disabilities and troubled young people. And then Alan Hoskins died of cancer on July 26, 1980 in Oakland, when he was 60. Sadder than anything else after he died, he was buried in an unmarked grave at Evergreen Cemetery. It took another 20 years, thanks to the efforts of fans, for Alan to finally get a proper headstone. And maybe that is the right way for this list to close. America remembers those faces very clearly. But their real lives, especially the years after the lights went out, were much easier to forget. Number 10. Sidney Kibrick as Woym. Sidney Kibrick leaves behind a very different kind of sadness on this list. It does not come from a violent fall or a broken life. It comes from the feeling that the very last door has just closed. Sidney was born in 1928 in Minneapolis, moved to Los Angeles when he was little, and then entered our gang in 1933. He appeared in more than 24 short films in the series, from 1933 to 1939, and starting around 1937, audiences began to remember him most clearly as Woym, the small, sly little boy who was often with Butch. Sidney was not a central face like Spanky or Alfalfa, but for the people who really grew up with our gang, Woym is a name you cannot mix up with anybody else. He was also the younger brother of Leonard Kibrick, another Our Gang actor. So, just about that whole family was tied to that world. What stands out is that Sidney left Hollywood very early. According to later accounts, by around 15, he had gotten tired of acting and decided to stop, even though his parents wanted him to keep going. Unlike many other child stars who struggled hard after leaving the screen, Sidney stepped into a much quieter life. He became a real estate developer, lived in Los Angeles, stayed in touch with old castmates, attended and even helped organize our gang reunions. In 2022, at a very advanced age, he was still present at the 100-year anniversary event for Our Gang at the Hollywood Museum. He was not just a former child actor. He was also a living bridge connecting today's audience to a black and white world that had drifted very far away. Sidney Kibrick died on January 2, 2026, in a hospital in Northridge, California at age 98. When he was gone, our gang did not just lose one more old face. It lost one of the very last witnesses who had actually stood inside that world. Looking back at all those faces, what stays with me the most is not just the way they died, but the enormous gap between the children who once made America smile and the real lives that very few people ever had time to see. Carl, Darla, Stymie, Froggy, Chubby, Spanky, Wheezer, Buckwheat, Scotty, Farina. Back then they were tiny, mischievous, lovable, and seemed like they would stay forever inside that gentle glow of black and white film. And now, even though they are all gone, they still hold a very special place in our hearts. And I still cannot help wondering whether becoming famous too early always comes with some kind of price, almost like a curse when those children step into the spotlight too soon and then have to carry that shadow for the rest of their lives. Maybe the kindest thing we can do today is remember them, tell their stories again, and share whatever memories we still hold on to about the Little Rascals. Because sometimes an old story, an old scene, or even just a name being spoken again is enough to keep a person with us a little longer in memory. And maybe that is exactly how those children live forever.